March, 1645. A ship is breaking apart in a storm off the coast of Lancashire. Below decks, a man is holding onto a sealed letter, like it's the only thing keeping him alive. In a way, it is. The letter carries the signature of King Charles I. It promises Irish Catholic rebels concessions wide enough to reshape a war in exchange for an army the king badly needs. And it comes with a title attached, one the king has just invented for the occasion, Earl of Glamorgan. The man's name is Edward Somerset. He survives the wreck. He doesn't reach Dublin for another 3 months. The mission does not survive cleanly, and neither, it turns out, does the title. Here's the strange part. If you've spent any time in a medieval strategy game and watched Glamorgan get handed to some earl on a title screen, that detail feels completely reasonable. It sounds exactly like the rank a Welsh region should have had. Dignified, old, the kind of thing that's been sitting in some family's coat of arms since the Middle Ages. It never was. This is not a knight's title. This is not a medieval baron's title. This is not a medieval title at all. It's 400 years too late for that, conjured up in the middle of a civil war by a king so desperate for help, he handed out a rank he may not have had the legal standing to give. And by the time you're done with this video, you'll know something stranger still. That exact title is in active use right now, today, held by a small child who has never governed so much as a garden shed. Meanwhile, the region it claims, real, actual Glamorgan, had already been run for nearly 4.5 centuries by men who never needed the word Earl at all. What they held instead was, in some ways, a bigger deal. So what was that bigger deal? Start with what Earl even means in England's system, because it's worth being precise here. An Earl is a rank. It sits inside a hierarchy. Duke, Marquess, Earl, Viscount, Baron. And it comes from the king, on the king's terms, revocable the way any English fief technically was. It's a badge you wear inside someone else's kingdom. What Robert Fitzhamon carved out of Glamorgan in the 1090s wasn't that. It was something England reserved for exactly a handful of places on its most dangerous borders. Chester, ruled by earls with near royal reach. Durham, ruled outright by its bishop, a man who by tradition wore a coronet like a duke's instead of a mitre. And out here on the Welsh border, the March. Historians call the fullest version of this a county palatine, a lord ruling with powers that were, in the Latin phrase, Gilbert de Clare himself used 2 centuries later to describe it, sicut regale, like unto a king. Not a figure of speech, his own courts, his own coinage rights in places, his own armies, raised and commanded without asking London first. The king's writ, which ran everywhere else in England, simply stopped at the border of the March. You want to know why nobody in charge of medieval Glamorgan bothered being an earl? Because earl was a demotion. The Welsh called this region Morgannwg, land of Morgan, after a Welsh ruler from a couple of centuries earlier. When the Normans folded 4 Welsh cantrefs, Gorfynydd, Penichin, Sencynydd, and Gwynlwg, into their new lordship, they kept the name and anglicized it into Glamorgan. That's not incidental. Whoever ran this place for 4.5 centuries was governing something the Welsh had already named, already organized, and were not going to stop fighting for. This is where the popular picture and the actual record split. The March wasn't a weaker, provincial cousin of a real earldom somewhere else in England. It was, on paper and often in practice, a private kingdom that happened to owe personal loyalty to a king in London, and only when that king was strong enough to collect on it. You're about to watch 4 different men run this system, generation after generation, and not one of them is going to reach for the word Earl to describe what they actually held here. They didn't need to. What they held was bigger. So if a game somewhere hands you an Earl of Glamorgan and expects you to nod along, it's not lying about the region mattering. It's just handing you the small version of what actually happened. The real title was so much stranger, it's almost hard to believe nobody's made a game about the real one yet. Meet the man who started it. Robert Fitzhamon was a Norman baron, already Lord of Gloucester, when he turned his attention west sometime around 1090 to 1093. Historians genuinely can't pin the date closer than that, which tells you something about how undocumented this whole affair was in the moment it happened. He crossed into the lowlands of Morgannog, allied himself with the local Welsh ruler, Iestyn ap Gwyrgen, against a rival prince, helped defeat that rival, and then did the thing every Norman baron here is about to do to somebody. He turned on his own ally. Iestyn's forces scattered. The chronicles say he ended his life in a monastery. Fitzhamon took Glamorgan. He built a castle at Cardiff on top of an old Roman fort, and that became the caput, the head, the administrative seat of the new lordship. From there, he divided the conquered lowlands among the Norman knights who'd fought with him, and left the mountainous north to Welsh lords, who kept a rough, resentful, semi-independence for generations. Now, this next part needs a caveat. There's a version of it that's genuinely popular, The 12 Knights of Glamorgan, a neat, cinematic tale of exactly 12 named companions dividing exactly 12 pieces of conquered land, each one the founder of a great Glamorgan family line. It's a wonderful tale. Welsh gentry families have been proud of their place in it for 500 years. It's also mostly invented. The earliest written version doesn't show up until 1561, in Edward Stradling's History, fleshed out further in 1578 by Rice Merrick's Morganiae Archaeographia. That's 4.5 centuries after the conquest it claims to describe. And when you check the record that's close to the events, the 12th century Liber Landavensis, it backs up something closer to 4 knights, not 12. The 12 knights weren't a Norman-era fact. They were a Tudor-era invention, stitched together by families who badly wanted a tidy, ancient explanation for why their ancestors owned what they owned. Which, if you think about it, is a very medieval reason to lie about the Middle Ages. The real conquest was messier than that, and a lot less secure than any founding legend wants to admit. 60-odd years after Fitzhamon died, in 1158, a Welsh lord named Efor Bach, ruler of the upland territory of Senginydd, one of the areas the Normans never fully pacified, stormed Cardiff Castle in the night and physically dragged William of Gloucester, the Lord of Glamorgan himself, out of his own fortress, along with his wife and son. This wasn't a folktale. This was the actual ruler of conquered Glamorgan, kidnapped from his own capital by a man whose land he supposedly controlled. Whatever this lordship was, it was not a settled kingdom quietly waiting to hand its earldom out to the next English baron in line. And this detail undercuts the entire premise a fictional Earl of Glamorgan would want you to believe. Robert Fitzhamon, the founder, the conqueror, the man this whole system starts with, was never formally created Earl of anything. Later writers got in the habit of calling him Earl of Gloucester, because his lands eventually became that earldom through his daughter's marriage a generation later. But in his own lifetime, in the actual documents, he's Lord of Gloucester and Conqueror of Glamorgan. Full stop. No patent of creation, no earldom. If the man who built this entire system from nothing didn't call himself an earl, that should tell you something about what the word was actually worth out here on the march. If that surprised you as much as it surprised me digging through the record, that's worth a like. It's how YouTube knows to put this in front of more people who'd want it. So far, no earls. Just a Norman lord who never earned the title, a legend invented 5 centuries after the fact, and a native Welsh lord who kidnapped his own conqueror's grandson-in-law out of a supposedly secure castle. And we're still in the 11 and 1200s. This channel exists for exactly this, pulling the real record out from under the version everyone assumes is true. If that's useful to you, subscribing means you won't miss where this goes next, because it gets stranger before it gets sadder. Stranger first, then, because the next Lord of Glamorgan built something almost too large to be believed. Gilbert de Clare inherited the lordship in 1263, at 19 years old, and by every account historians can piece together, he was already one of the richest teenagers who has ever existed, an income that, translated into modern terms, historians estimate at well over £1 million a year. on top of 200 English manors and a title as Earl of Gloucester and Hertford that he held completely separately from his Welsh lordship. His lands alone obligated him to supply the crown with roughly 260 knights on demand, a small private army, answering to him first. What he did with all of that, starting in 1268, was build carefully. Not a castle in the ordinary sense, the largest castle in Wales, and at the time, the largest concentric fortress in Britain outside of Windsor, meaning walls inside walls inside walls, each ring a fresh problem for an attacker who'd already survived the last one. De Clare dammed 2 streams to flood the ground around it, turning the whole structure into an island reachable only by controlled causeways. You could open the sluices and simply erase the approach. It didn't go untested. In 1270, Llewellyn ap Grufford's forces descended on the half-built site and burned what timber and stores they could reach before royal officials stepped in and forced a withdrawal. De Clare didn't scale the design back. He rebuilt, harder, on the ashes. This is a man building not a home, not even really a fortress in the usual sense. He's building a statement, aimed as much at the King of England as at the Welsh prince across the border. And that statement had teeth. In 1291, De Clare got into a land dispute with his neighbor, Humphrey de Bohun, Earl of Hereford, over a border castle at Morlaix. It didn't stay a dispute. 2 of the most powerful men in England raised their own forces and fought each other, privately, without the crown's permission, because on the march that was, in theory, their right. Edward I did not agree. He had both earls arrested, fined, and briefly stripped of their lands as a very public lesson. The march could act sicut regale, right up until the king decided it couldn't. They got their lands back within the year. The lesson, everyone understood, still landed. One detail is worth sitting with, because historians genuinely don't agree on it. Some sources call Glamorgan, even before any of this, something close to a county palatine in its own right, in the same rare category as Chester and Durham, while others treat it as simply the grandest of the ordinary marcher lordships, no more formally exceptional than its neighbors, just wealthier and better fortified. Nobody's fully settled which is more accurate. If you've got a theory, or you've read the primary sources closer than I have, the comments are open on this one. De Clare died in 1295. His son, the 8th Earl, died childless at Bannockburn in 1314. And here is where things turn from stranger to sadder. The lordship passed, through the dead Earl's sister Eleanor, to her husband, a minor knight named Hugh Despenser the Younger, who was about to become one of the most hated men in English history. Despenser squeezed his own brothers-in-law out of their shares of the inheritance through what amounted to legal extortion, then secured a grant of full sovereignty over Glamorgan from his close friend, and by most contemporary accounts, more than friend, King Edward II. And this is the specific detail that matters for the whole video. Every single Lord of Glamorgan before him had been known first by an English earldom, Gloucester or Hertford, with the Welsh lordship trailing along as a secondary asset. Despenser was the first man in this entire 200-year span to describe himself formally as Lord of Glamorgan. Not Earl of anything, Lord. That was the actual, real, medieval title, and it took until 1317, more than 2 centuries after Fitzhamond's conquest, for anyone to even bother writing it down that plainly. He did not wear the title gently. Despenser was so notorious for seizing any stray sheep or cattle that wandered onto his land that Welshmen had a saying for it. If something went missing, it had gone to Caerphilly. The poet Dafydd ap Gwilym cursed an enemy by wishing his corpse would join it there. By 1321, the barons of England had had enough. 800 men-at-arms and 10,000 foot soldiers marched into Glamorgan and devastated it end to end. In what's remembered as the 10 Days Raid, Parliament forced Despenser into exile that August. He came back within a year. That should tell you this isn't finished escalating. It wasn't finished escalating. It was about to end, all at once, in front of a crowd. By 1326, Despenser and Edward II had run out of allies. Queen Isabella invaded from France with Roger Mortimer at her side, and almost the entire country went over to her. That's how despised the Despensers had become. His father, left behind to hold Bristol, was captured there and executed within days. Edward and the younger Despenser kept moving west, toward the one place he could still call safe ground, carefully. The fortress the Red Earl had built to be unbreakable. They were captured anyway, near Lantresant, in open country, in what sources describe as a violent storm. What happened at Hereford on the 24th of November doesn't need much embellishing, because the historical record is already brutal enough on its own. Despenser was tried in the town square in front of the Queen herself, sentenced, and then hanged, drawn, and castrated on a gallows 50 feet high. His body afterwards sent in quarters to 4 different cities as a warning. One chronicler even claims Isabella and Mortimer feasted as they watched, a detail modern historians treat with real skepticism. But even without it, the crowd's mood on record is ugly enough. The man who'd once decided he owned every stray sheep in South Wales died having almost nothing left of himself at all. This wasn't really about a castle anymore, or a coat of arms, or a coal seam, or a coronation robe. This was the true cost of holding Lord of Glamorgan, when the king who granted it. For 2 more centuries, men kept holding that title, Lord, never Earl, until Henry VIII simply erased the whole system. The Laws in Wales Acts of the 1530s folded the Marcher lordships into ordinary English-style counties, Glamorgan included. No more private courts, no more private armies, no more sicut regale, just a county with a sheriff, like anywhere else in England. 450 years of Marcher rule, and the office of Lord of Glamorgan simply stopped existing, mid-sentence, by Act of Parliament. Which brings us back to the shipwreck. A little over a century after Glamorgan became an ordinary county with no lord at all, Charles I needed an army he couldn't otherwise get. Edward Somerset was Catholic, well-connected in Ireland, and willing to negotiate what the king couldn't be seen negotiating himself. A treaty promising sweeping concessions to Irish Catholic rebels in exchange for troops to save the royalist cause. The king dressed the offer up with a brand new title, Earl of Glamorgan, not Lord, Earl, a rank that had never once, in 4.5 centuries of actual governance, belonged to this place. You already know how the crossing went. What you didn't know yet is what happened after Somerset finally reached Kilkenny. The treaty leaked. The Marquis of Ormond, Charles's own commander in Ireland, publicly branded Somerset a traitor. The king disowned him within months. And when the monarchy came back after the Civil War, the lawyers looked at the original grant and found the paperwork itself questionable enough that the earldom was never formally recognized as valid. The one and only Earl of Glamorgan in recorded history was created out of desperation, blew up the mission he was created for, and wasn't even legally real by the time the dust settled. He spent more than 2 years afterward locked in the Tower of London for his trouble. What he came out with was, of all things, an idea, a water-commanding engine, built with an engineer named Caspar Kaltoff, that some historians now count among the earliest ancestors of the steam engine. The man Charles I, dressed up as a fake medieval earl, accidentally helped invent the future instead. And here's the part that should be more surprising than anything else in this video. That title never actually died. It just stopped meaning anything and kept being worn anyway. Today, Earl of Glamorgan is the courtesy title automatically given to the eldest son of the heir to the Dukedom of Beaufort, and the person currently holding it was born in 2021. Somewhere in England right now, there is a small child who is, on paper, the Earl of Glamorgan, and has exactly as much authority over the region as Charles I's disgraced spy did after 1646, which is to say, none. It's just a name that survived its own collapse by 400 years, worn now by someone in nursery school. That's the kind of detail that's fun to bring up at dinner, honestly. Watch someone's face change when they realize the medieval title they half remember from somewhere is younger than the Mayflower and currently belongs to a toddler. So let's take stock. Three things worth keeping from all of this. 1. For 4.5 centuries, nobody who mattered here was an Earl. Fitzhamon, the De Clares, Dispenser, they were lords of Glamorgan, ruling under marcher powers that in practice outranked most English earldoms, right up until Henry the Fitzy erased the entire system by statute. 2. The Earl of Glamorgan you might have run into somewhere isn't a lie exactly. It's real. It's just off by 400 years, born out of a shipwrecked secret mission that ended in disgrace, and never even legally confirmed by the crown that invented it. 3. And this is the one that should actually stick with you. That fictional-sounding title is not resting quietly in a museum somewhere. It's active, right now. Worn by a child who was born the same year some of you were watching lockdown videos on this platform. History didn't end when the title stopped meaning anything. It just kept the name and let the meaning fall away. One question, before you go. Of the 4 men who actually ran this place, Fitzhamon, who never even claimed the rank he's remembered by, Gilbert de Clare, who built a fortress the size of a small town, Dispenser, who lost everything including his own body in a public square, or Somerset, whose entire earldom was built on a lie that got him disowned. Which one would you want in charge, if some game handed you the choice? Tell me below, and if your answer is none of them, that's probably the most historically accurate response available. 4.5 centuries of lords, 1 disgraced earl, and a toddler wearing the leftovers. That's Glamorgan. Not a single fictional title required.